You've been on LinkedIn, you've been applying to jobs, you've been putting in the work, connecting, networking, reaching out to people that work where you want to be, forming a relationship and asking for referrals, and you finally get it. You get that invitation to apply an interview with the company of your dreams. So today I'm going to show you the truth behind what a typical big tech interview looks like and how you can prepare yourself to be able to pass it on your first try. Now realistically, it might be your second, it might be your third, but we are going to try our best to prepare to pass it on our first try. And the reason I know this is because I've interviewed with a bunch of companies. I'm talking about Amazon, Stripe, TikTok, Dropbox, Okta, Yelp, and literally so many more that I just can't remember. And they all have very similar stages, so we're going to jump right into it. Now, based on what I've seen in my career, big tech interviews have three main steps more or less. The first one being the recruiter interview, the next one being the take-home assessment or initial screening, and the last and most serious one being the virtual onsite, which is the main thing. So we're going to start with the first step, which is recruiter screening. I want to come in and say that this step can either make you or break you, but the truth is, everything can either make you or break you. This step isn't technical at all, at least most of the time it's not. It's literally almost like a sales call where you try to sell yourself almost. The person talking to you most times isn't too strong technically. I believe their goal is to see if you're going to be a good fit or not, and if it's even worth taking you to the next round and waste man hours trying to interview you. Basically, they just assess your confidence in what you're talking about, and they try and see if you've worked with any of the technologies you're told to recruit for. For instance, if it's a front-end role and you come in and say, I have never written a line of front-end code in my life, or JavaScript or React, they're not going to want to move forward with you, even if you're strong in everything else. In my experience, most of the time, if you just read the job description and mirror it back while formatting it in your own way, in your resume, you'll pass this round. Just be confident, be likable, tell a joke here and there, and just have all the buzzwords from the job description. Learn a little bit about the company beforehand, have a few questions to ask them, and it's that simple. Typically, when applying for a job, I know it's hard and not always worth it to apply or configure a resume to every single job description, especially when you're mass applying. So try and apply to things that you already know or you're already somewhat confident in doing. Like for instance, if I'm confident in Java or I'm confident in Golang, I would only interview or apply for jobs that are asking for Java or Golang. I wouldn't try and break my resume down and like try and fine tune it for every single other job that deals with anything else. For instance, you're looking for a software engineer new grad position, and you finally got a call back from let's say you got a call back from RBC, for instance. Now the very first thing is that when I would apply for this kind of job, I would first of all look at the responsibilities, what their ideal candidate should have, and then I would make sure that my resume kind of matches that. So you know for sure my resume is going to have something along the lines of experience with Python or Golang. For instance, I have experience with these two languages already, so I would make sure that I apply for a job that has something like these languages. I would make sure that we are talking about backend services, for instance, databases, asset compliance, just stuff like that. AWS, for instance, a lot of experience there. I would make sure that my resume has something that alludes to AWS or deployment on AWS. And then what a technical recruiter could possibly ask you is that, okay, describe to me a time where you had to deploy something on AWS, for instance, or what's your experience or comfort level with Python? Have you worked on large code bases? Stuff like that is what they would ask you. So you don't have to worry about anything too technical here. Honestly, in my opinion, as long as you sound confident enough saying it and you are somewhat correct, you should be fine for this stage. But the most important thing is actually the housekeeping questions, like when can you start? Do you live in the city that the job is in? What's your compensation? Like, what's your compensation requirements? And just things like that. To pass this stage, honestly, I would just focus on looking good. Like, I would make sure that I'm wearing a good outfit, my microphone is clear, I don't look weird, because think about it, you're working with someone, right? The most important thing is to be likable. So for this stage, just be really likable, crack a joke here and there, have a few questions about the company, like make sure you know what the company does beforehand. For instance, this is RBC, it's a bank, obviously, but you want to try and see if they discuss the team. Okay, so look right here, they're looking for the RBC's AI group. So this is the group they're going to work on. I don't know anything about this, but I will go and research about this and make sure that like I'm going to ask questions about this. For instance, I see that the business enablement function, so then I'll ask like, oh, what does this team actually do? Is this team a cohort? How many team members would I be working in? You know, you want to sound like you already got the job. So that's kind of it for this step. The next step is a little different and you can't really bullshit your way out of that. So let's get into it. Stage 2 is the optional, some kind of optional take-home assessment, and this is where things start to get a little interesting. You get a small question or small set of questions that really try to test your performance before you can move on to the main interview, which is the on-site. This comes in 3 major formats. The first one being a take-home assessment using tools like CoderPad, HackerRank, a take-home project where you go home and build stuff, or my favorite, a quick live coding session. So let's go through all of them. For the take-home assessment, you get an email from a company called HackerRank or CodeSignal or CoderPad, one of those companies which are basically coding platforms. And you have to answer a question or a set of questions for anywhere from 45 minutes to 90 minutes. You're not talking to anyone at this point, but you typically share your screen and audio so that they can know you're not looking at anyone or talking to anyone. And then you just solve whatever they ask you. It really helps for you to work with the platform beforehand or solve some sample questions on the platform beforehand, just because you might get some surprises when you actually try and solve it. This is HackerRank. This is what a HackerRank platform looks like. And let's just pick a random question, right? Just to kind of show you what you should expect. So you kind of have this very long question here, and then you have your, should I say, CoderPad or whatever this is, your IDE to run code. At the very top, you can pick like whatever language you want to pick. So I'm happy mine is set on JavaScript. I'll leave it as that. And I'm not going to go ahead and solve this, but I will tell you the most important thing you can do at this step is to comprehensively read this question, because you have like maybe 45 minutes to 1 hour. So the most important thing you can do is to read this question once, twice, thrice. Make sure you fully understand the question before you even write a single line of code. And that is so important, not just to understand the code, but to understand how the platform works. I'll give you an example. So I had an interview with Stripe once, and I got like the online assessment and everything. I went through like the first speaking to the recruiter, then got like the first online assessment. Good. Now the thing about Stripe is that they do not ask you like technical questions per se. It's still technical, but it's not like, that's the wrong word to use. They do not ask you lead code style questions, but it's still technical. So it wasn't a very hard problem to solve. The issue was that these questions are typically broken down into 3 steps. For instance, they'll tell you to go through step 1, completely solve step 1, go to step 2, completely solve step 2, and go to step 3, and then completely solve step 3. And for every single case you solve, let me try submitting this, for instance, to show you guys. You can see there's like 15 test cases, and out of those 15 test cases, only 2 of them are visible. So you can only see like the questions for 2, like the input for 2. You can't see the inputs. It just tells you that you failed it. So you can't even see and debug. Now the Stripe, the way it was set up was that you had, typically what I'm used to is that after solving the first step and you press run, you pass all 16 test cases. You get what I mean? Like, it's not like you pass the first 5 and then you run for the next 5. But that was how Stripe was set up. They put all the test cases for the entire problem, so they didn't really break it down. So I spent a lot of time trying to get my number 1 question to solve all 16 test cases. Meanwhile, it's only supposed to make the first 5 pass, and the first 5 passed. So I ended up just wasting my time. At the very end, I then took a read through it again. I'm like, what's going on? Like, what is going on? And then I read through this and I'm like, oh my goodness, they mentioned that only the first 5 would pass for test case for question 1, and for question 2 the next 5, and for question 3 the next 6. And then I started like sprinting. But at this point in time, there was only like 20 more minutes, 10 more minutes. I was like coding my life out, and I only managed to get, I think, 11 out of 16 test cases passed. And if I just read it properly, I just knew that you need to only account for the first 5 test cases in the beginning. I would be good. Another thing is that when you're solving this, because you're not speaking to anyone, there's no like feedback loop, which is why I don't really like this type of questions. But as you can see, some test cases are hidden. This happens all the time. They won't show you what you're feeling. So what you can do for this is to kind of log what input they give you. So for instance, if you come over here, you might do something like console.log G and P, and that just might help you see what the input is. That's a trick I use all the time. So I don't know if it logged. Did it log? I don't know if it did. It didn't log. Anyways, you should be able to like log what it says the input is, and then you might be able to see what or why that input is failing for your own test case, and then typically you can test it against a custom input. So if you logged the input that was hidden before, you can then test it again. But all in all, I like this kind of testing method. What I hate about it is that like there's no one to speak to, because in reality, if you're having a stupid problem, like for instance, your test case is only solving the first 3. If you had an interviewer, a real human being with you, they can just tell you that, oh, you're not supposed to pass all right now, keep on going. And it's such a simple mistake that you just make. So this is the first option that you have for coding. Anyways, this wouldn't be my number 1 pick for like an initial assessment or initial screening, just because there's no one to speak to, and like all those very simple mistakes, like things that are outside of your control, can just happen. Maybe your Wi-Fi goes out or something and you're not given any grace for it. So not the worst, but also not the best. Okay, so the next assessment type I see very commonly is a take-home assessment, and I absolutely hate this assessment because it is typically very, very long, and they might not even call you back. But the bright side is that it's typically to solve some sort of project, like say build this type of app, or build a mobile app, or build a backend that does this, or build a Slack bot. It can really be anything. It's not so algorithmic, so to say, but it's more so like a test of your real world skills. So in theory, it's actually a very good way to test someone. I just don't really like it because it's a lot longer as well. Like building out a small project can take you like a day or 2, as opposed to just dedicating 1 hour to do something. For instance, right now I'm on my GitHub account and I'm viewing this from an incognito tab, so I'm viewing this as a guest, I'm not signed in. So these are all my public repositories. A lot of these are projects that are built from, a company of some sort. So like for instance, this is a snake game in Python. This took me a while to build, and this was, as you can see, this was before AI was even a thing 4 years ago. So this was all by hand. Like you had to write all of this by hand and like come up with the logic and stuff like that. So not very hard, but it just takes a lot of time, especially when there is a huge chance you're not going to get a call back. Let's go to something else. Most popular news on YC, I think this was a Swift, or this was just like an API or something. A basic Spring Boot server. These are just a bunch of projects that companies will tell you, oh, build this out and upload it, and then you just never hear back from them, which is so annoying. Like I remember this one, for instance, a Netflix clone. It had the back end and the front end. This took me a while to build out, and I had to upload some videos, I had to set up an AWS account and all of that, and I just didn't get a call back from them. So it's not like companies owe you a call back, it's just that sometimes, if you're going to let me do 3 days of work, maybe only give it to like 2 people, so at least you call 1 person back. And even if you don't call me back, give me a good reason. So that's why I absolutely hate. When I mean hate, oh look, this was definitely an interview one, because you can see the interview questions were here. I don't remember what job this was because I didn't hear back from them, but they asked me to build out a React Native stuff. Now I will say, typically these kind of problems are more common with smaller companies. I'll say bigger companies do tend to ask a lot more. Either they give you like a coding assessment or an in-person per interview stage or something like that. But bigger companies don't typically ask this type of questions, and that's good because I absolutely hate these. And last but not least, my favorite type for this category is the in-person screen. So basically, you and someone, an interviewer, would get on a call, you share your screen, they give you a problem, and you guys just go ahead and solve the problem together. This is my best because there's so many ways you can win. You can first of all show your personality, you can be cool, you can also see the interviewer's personality, learn a little bit more about the job, and you don't have to actually perfectly solve the problem. Like if you're close enough, they might just really like you and say, you know what, your head was in the right direction, let's move forward. So that's why I like this so much. And if you get to pick between these 3 options, you should always try and go for this particular one. Now this should I say in-person screen is very similar to the technical on-site, so I'm going to just wrap those together. So let's get into the technical on-site. All right, so say you might need to clear the first 2 stages of your interviews, you then get into the technical on-site. Now this is the main bulk of your interview, and it's typically the last step. Now some companies choose to ask this at different days. There is typically 4 to 5 interviews, and some companies choose to space this out, while some rather just ask everything at once. So you might book out 6 hours of a day and you just kind of go through all the different interviews. Now, I prefer it that way because if you space it out, you might get to the very last step and you can still fail. So to me, I'd rather just have it in one day. If I have it in one day, it feels like, it's just one interview, but really whatever floats your boat. So typically what would happen is that you would have 3 or 4 data structure and algorithm questions, and then 1 system design, and then typically 1 hiring manager interview or values interview, something like that, or culture. Now that culture one can come at any step. It can come just before the onsite, or it can come after the onsite, and it's typically, rather than culture, it's typically with the hiring manager. It depends. Different companies do it in different ways, but that overall structure is kind of the same. So what we're going to do is that we're going to go through how to pass this data structure and algorithm one, and then system design. Now, both are equally important, but it's just because you're going to code like maybe 6 different times in this process, and maybe you have system design once, and then you have like maybe a recruiter kind of screen like once. So it's important that your data structure and algorithms is dialed in. Now for DSA problems, the good thing about it is that once you learn how to solve it once, every single subsequent interview becomes significantly easier. You just need to kind of refresh yourself, refresh with the list, and you are fine. Trust me. For instance, that's why on TraceDev, right now we have like all sorts of data structures, not really all sorts, but data structures that you would actually need to be able to pass interviews, like the ones that you must know. And then you also have every single algorithm that you would need. And this isn't just by like trying to figure out what fancy algorithm to put out there. Let's go to a list right now. If you look at this list, lead code 75, you have arrays, 2 pointers, sliding windows, prefix sums. You have a bunch of different like algorithms that you might need to understand. And then if you look at needs code 150, you also have something similar. The trick to passing this, very simply, if you can solve leads code 75 or needs code 150, truly solving it, not that like you memorized it, but you can see the question and understand the pattern immediately, you can solve almost any DSA problem, because most companies pull from these kind of lists. Now the company will still restructure it in their own way. For instance, a company like Amazon might format the question in a way that has to do with like delivering orders, or a company like Stripe might order the question in a way that has to do with fulfilling payments. But if you can solve these problems, like you can go randomly to a problem and just easily solve it, you are going to be fine. And that's what TraceDev seeks to offer, by just basically being able to show you every single algorithm that you might see, and you have to kind of truly understand it in order to move forward. As you can see, you have questions that are asked based on this problem. For instance, sliding window, merge sorts, quick sorts, trees, backtracking, topological sort. Every single one of these problems are real interview problems that you have to understand. And if you understand every single one of these algorithms, all those lists should be very simple for you to get. So what we're going to do here is that we're going to look at a random question here. I don't really know which one. We're going to look at a random question here and just figure out how would we solve this in an interview process. So let's look at this. Count good nodes in a binary tree. So the first thing when you get to this step, you want to first of all kind of build out a rapport with your interviewer. Oh, hey guys, my name is this, I've worked here, this is what I am, and this is what I'm about. Now they give you the problem. Something I see a lot is that some interviewers like to yap. Some interviewers like to talk so much, and they are eating into your time, and then you don't get to solve the problem, which is very bad. I've had this happen to me sometimes. They just keep on talking, and then when it's time for me to solve the problem, I don't have enough time. So while you are talking, you also want to kind of egg them that like, guys, can we start solving this problem? We can talk after I finish solving the problem, that kind of thing. So you want to first of all read the problem with them. Always think out loud. For instance, given a binary tree root, a node X in the tree is named good if the path from the root to X. If in the path from the root to X there are no nodes with a value greater than X, return the number of good nodes in the binary tree. So this is good, and then going back all the way to this is good. 4 is good. A node X in the tree is named good if the path from root X to X node and binary tree. So basically what you want to first of all do is read the question, understand the question, and read out loud. As you're reading, be speaking to your interviewer, be like, oh, so I'm seeing right now you're going to have a tree with the roots, and a node X in the tree is good if the path from the roots to X there are no nodes with a value greater than X. That means from 4, for instance, up to the way to the top, there is no node greater than that, or from 5 all the way to the top, there is no node greater than that. Now, I have solved this problem before. Obviously, I've solved almost every single. I've solved so many problems here, but I don't remember solving the problem before. And just looking at this right now, I can see that this is going to be some sort of depth first search, I would say. So you have like some sort of result at the very top. You want to dial in from every single node, and then when you get to every single portion, you kind of return a result where you just go back and check. That's one way. Another way is that as you're going down, you only store the minimum, and then when you get to the next step, okay, the minimum right before was 3 and now it's 1, so 1 is less than 3, therefore this node cannot be good, and you store the maximum actually, and then you keep on going from there. So I can already tell you that the solution for this is very straightforward. But when you are solving this is my result. What the hell is this? My result? I think this is my result. Oh, this is my submission. That's crazy. Well, yeah. Okay, guys, I swear I did not say that when I was talking about this. I haven't talked this in a while, as you can see. The last time I submitted this was a few months ago, so I haven't seen this in a while. But long story short, you want to speak to the recruiter about what it is that you're doing. You want to tell them what it is what your thought process is. Don't just go ahead and start solving something. Like, be telling them, okay, so I'm thinking we're going to use a depth first search. How does that sound to you? More than likely they'll keep quiet, and that's one thing that upsets me. They just keep quiet. They're like, oh, you do what you think is best. Like, anyways, they'll probably keep quiet. They'll tell you to do what you think is best, but at least communicate that with them. That's something they really, really like. Show your thought process and solve this. You're going to do this 3 or 4 times. So after this, you might then see something else like, let's go to a random one. Product of array except. This is something I've solved so many times. Product of array except solve. You want to read through every single thing and then solve it. And the same thing goes for the NIST code 150. You want to be able to pick anything here except from bits manipulation and sometimes dynamic programming. You want to be able to pick anything here and solve it. And the good thing about TraceDev is that TraceDev actually has a bunch of lists that you would need. So we actually went ahead and compiled a bunch of beginner lists that you have to be able to solve this list before you can even think about solving the list code 75, blind 75, grind 75 and stuff like that. You want to be able to solve each of these lists. And once you go through the full course load, the process of actually like getting ready for an interview is as simple as coming up to one of these questions and then just going ahead to solve it. Now, one thing I really like about TraceDev is that, for instance, if you click on this, every single question is reformatted. You don't really know what question is what. So this question, you might read it, it might have the same idea, underlying idea, but you cannot find it online by Googling it because it doesn't there. So it stops you from being able to cheat as easily. And what you have to do is, again, read through the question, try and solve it, time yourself. Like, we have mock interviews and a bunch over here. So yeah, that's typically how you beat the data structure algorithm. You want to make sure that you know and I cannot stress this enough, you want to know every single data structure first of all. You want to understand the data structure, and then you want to understand the algorithm. New algorithms don't really pop out. New data structures don't really pop out. Only new technologies that are built upon these existing data structures and algorithms. That's why once you learn this once and truly cement it, you're good. Okay, so that is it for data structures and algorithms. Now, a few other tips are you just want to make sure that you are likable, make sure that you have questions or leadership principle questions, or just situational questions about the team for every single different interviewer. It can get annoying, I know. You might have to ask about 12, you might have to keep up 12 different questions just to ask 3 for each interviewer. Very annoying, but you have to do that, and just stuff like that. Afterwards, the last main interview that you have to think about is system design. And system design is a whole other ball game of its own. Like, it's completely different. It's not like programming. It's actually very conversational, but also very theoretical. For instance, look at this. You might have to design something like, a web crawler, which is basically Google. How do you design that? They just give you something so massive and tell you, design Google, or design, for instance, let's see, a rate limiting API, or for instance, design QuickBooks. And there's so much more we have on TraceDev. Let's see, designing like a messenger, Yelp, Uber, Tinder, YouTube and Netflix, designing Instagram, Pinterest, and literally that is how it is. They will tell you, hey, could you design Instagram for me? And then you're like, what do you mean design Instagram? Instagram is so massive. But that's where it comes from. That's how it works. You want to take a very massive problem and break it down. So you want to first of all go ahead by defining the requirements. First of all, you can't design the whole of Instagram in like 1 hour. So what part of Instagram do you want me to define? Do you want me to design like the messaging portion? Do you want me to design like the actual image upload, which most of the time that's what they would mean? Do you want me to design like, you just have to first of all define that, then figure out like how many users are we expecting. You have to ask all these questions and write them down. I think in my notes I wrote that down. So you want to ask clarifying questions, you want to define what APIs are going to be needed, and then you want to just have a better grasp of what we're designing. Like you want to understand scale. Are we going to be writing a lot more than we are reading? If you're reading a lot more than you're writing, it's a different type of database to use. And you want to define all of that. You want to understand bottlenecks, availability, stuff like that. And then you just go ahead and start small. You start small, get the first, MVP, and then you expand on it. So for instance, if you're doing this, we say something like trace dev. First of all, you can't even go ahead and start learning system design. You first of all need to understand what the cloud is, things like databases, caching, CDNs. You have to understand all of that, real-time communication, networking. You need to understand every single thing before you can even begin to think about, okay, let's design something. Now, say you want to design something like a URL shortener. How TraceDev does it is that you have your interviewer over here to the left, and then you have requirements at the top. So this interviewer is like, it's kind of an AI interviewer, but it's also kind of deterministic. So you have to define the right set of items here in order to move forward to the next step. But you kind of understand that, okay, we need a client, an app server, and a SQL database. This can be considered, an MVP for a URL shortener. But then you then run a load test and you see that, okay, this fails at big loads. So it's up to you to then add in like maybe a load balancer, or add in like an auto scaling group, or just stuff like that, which is actually how it happens in real life too. Because this is like a real life example. So you need to have load balancer, you need to have WebSockets, binders, schedulers, this whole thing. So system design is very conversational. It's not as deterministic as code, where once you're correct, nothing can take that from you. Here there can be so many different ways to solve a problem. The only way you can get good at system design is first of all understanding every single component there is to it, by like learning every single thing here. But the next thing is actually just practicing. You need to practice a lot. You need to read a lot of books. You need to watch YouTube videos that do that. You need to, for instance, do all of these design challenges, and then you yourself need to ask questions when you're using like something like, for instance, during the World Cup, I was literally watching the World Cup and I was like, how are they streaming this to every single person, and why is that some people's on ahead rather than below? So that kind of thing, you need to just be curious, understand it. This is your job, this is your life. So understand how that kind of thing is designed. And once you start like learning about this, I would say this system design actually has bigger impact to your real 9 to 5 than data structure and algorithms, because as I said before, there's no new data structures coming in as much, and there's no new algorithms coming in. So it can only change so much, as opposed to system design where like, okay, now I know how to build something like a video streaming service, a live video streaming service. You might have to build that in your job. So because you understand how to build that system design, you can actually lead or champion that like workflow. So I think that some system design is actually something that is very important, both for interviewing and also for your day-to-day life at your job. So that wraps it up for the last technical bits of your interviews. Now, 1 or 2 interviews I didn't really talk about much was the hiring manager interview and the cultural interview. Now, some companies have this cultural interview where they try to see if you're a good fit. Again, to pass that, just be a really likable person. Be a really likable person, have questions. I always have sticky notes on my desk, so write a few questions on sticky notes, put them down, and just ask those questions at the end of your interview. Be a likable person. For the hiring manager interview, it's kind of like the recruiter screen, but you need to be very aware of every single thing you have in your resume, because they're going to dive deep into your resume. So hopefully you're not lying about what you have on your resume, because this is where they're actually going to dive deep into it. So even if you kind of inflate some of the things you did on your resume, maybe you worked on something but then you say you let it, why are you doing that? But even if you did that, you need to be able to defend that from a technical standpoint, because they're going to dive deep into it. So they're going to ask you what made you make these decisions, what made you choose to go in this direction instead of the other direction. You want to discuss trade-offs a lot. You want to discuss like timelines. You want to discuss not just developing but also the value that it's bring to users, because at the end of the day, this is a business and you want to drive revenue or value to users. So it's not about like I made this kind of crazy XYZ is that I made this decision that led to X amount in growth or X amount in, user revenue or stuff like that. So that's kind of what that is for those 2 interviews. To wrap this up, I have a few tips and tricks to crush your interviews. And the first one, again, as always, is to have a good personality and always look good. You want to have a good personality and you want to look good. Like, don't come with your hair messed up, looking crazy. Make sure your camera is clear, make sure your Wi-Fi connection is good, and just, again, I keep saying this, be a likable person. This is very important. Be a likable person. Do not, like, I don't want to say don't be too opinionated, but like, don't be an asshole, just be a cool person, be a nice person, and you should be good on that front. The next one is to have some stories to tell. So let me just pull this up. But as you guys can see over here, I have these SDE notes, and originally the reason I had this was like, it was in response to Amazon's leadership principle questions. So basically, these are some things where they want to kind of know what you think about or what you would do in these situations. For instance, customer obsession, ownership, invent and simplify. You can ignore all of that. The main thing is looking at the answers to these questions. Like, tell me about the time you had to make a decision about how to best serve a customer or a group of customers. Tell me about the time you had to make a decision between long-term value or short-term results. Basically, you want to have answers to all these type of questions, because these are questions that you can be asked at any time. So tell me about the time you had to look for new ideas. Tell me about the time you were misunderstood by a team member or supervisor. I actually get that quite a lot. Tell me about the time where you failed. All these kind of things, you want to make sure that you have these questions or answers to these kind of questions laid out, or at least you have ideas behind it. So I actually put this document along with other resources in the Trace Dev Discord, so you guys can join Trace Dev Discord. I will leave a link in the description for you guys to join the community, but I would leave a link to that below. But basically, that's something else you really want to do. You want to make sure you have answers to these kind of questions, and then be likable, study again a lot. If you're using Trace Dev, grind it out, finish it. You only really need to do that once. Every other interview is just like, nowadays whenever I have an interview, I just really schedule like 2 weeks and I go through the whole Lead Code 75 problems again. Lead Code 75, if I have more time, I would do like Lead Code 150. But if I can do all of those and I truly understand each and every single one of them, except from the bitwise and dynamic programming. If you ask me a bitwise question, I'm just going to leave. Or if you ask me a dynamic programming question, most of the time, I will just stand up and leave. However, you want to be able to solve all of those. If you can solve all of those, you'll be fine. So this is something that you want to do once, which is why we try to, if you look at Trace Dev, for instance, we try to make sure that you can't skip by anything. Like, it is of utmost importance that you truly understand it. If you understand it once, you're good. So if you want to join Trace Dev, or if you want to join the Discord and just ask questions and learn with other people, see other people that they're going on their journey, I will leave links in the description. And if you have any other questions or thoughts that you want to share, please leave that in the comments below, and I will see you guys on the next one.